Welcome to today's presentation called Lost Springfield. This presentation will be focusing on the fires that had destroyed many buildings and homes in Springfield, as well as progress, for progress' sake, for destroying homes to build new things. So here we go. Of course, this program is brought to you by myself, Richard Crabtree, a realtor from Ernie Associates, been serving the greater Springfield area for 10 years, focusing on the sale and purchase of older homes in the greater Springfield area. If you're in need of a realtor, focusing on history, restoration, and the sale and purchase of older homes, I would be more than happy to help. On with our presentation. The first house we come to is the John Polk Campbell house. This particular house was built in 1852. Now, Mr. Campbell had came to Springfield earlier, carved his initials in a tree by a spring on the square, and went to Texas, came back, ended up going back to Texas again, did not like Texas, decided in 1851, 1852 that he was probably going to move back to Springfield, reached out to Mr. Gott, and had them build the house. Now, the house was to mimic his grandfather's house in Tennessee, which was mimicking a house that had been built in Ireland. He unfortunately did not get to stay there very long, as he died while they were in the process of planting the orchards. His wife, Louisa, she did get to stay there, as well as one of the daughters, Sarah Rush Campbell Owen. The house would end up being moved in 1921 as the family sold the property to the Springfield school system, and they built Jarrett Junior High. Then, about 20 some odd years later, another relative in the family had reached out to the city in 1944 and offered to sell them the house, figuring since Mr. Campbell was the founder of the town, that they would maybe want to make a history museum out of it, or just save it for prosperity's sake. And unfortunately, the city said no. And so within the next 10 years, the house would be leveled. And this is what we have today. So sad. Next house is the Jonathan Fairbanks home at 847 Sherman. Mr. Fairbanks had this home built in 1869. For those of you who do not know who Jonathan Fairbanks is, he is our first Springfield School Systems superintendent. The house put up for sale by his son in 1924. The home was sold and it was moved to 1001 East Brower in 1931. Now today, this street, you know it as Bob Barker. And this is the home after it had been moved there and they had enclosed in the back porch. And everything seemed just fine and nobody had bothered the house. Unfortunately, OTC was planning a major campaign of expansion, and the house was in the way. Although there was many who thought that this house should be saved and moved or utilized on campus, today, unfortunately, it did not survive, and it is resting comfortably in a landfill north of Springfield. On to the Metropolitan Hotel. Now, this hotel was built in 1870, and it was kind of an answer for the railroad. They knew the railroad was coming. They really had hoped it was going to be closer to downtown. So this particular hotel was built of a heavy influence of France and New Orleans. Had a metal facade on the front, a lot of wrought iron coming out of the windows. It was just a beautiful, beautiful hotel. Here we can see a picture of actually some ladies that were in the 1890s. This was our one and only kind of Rose Bowl parade, if you will, parked out front. Definitely had more of a European flair to the hotel. And it was beautiful on the inside. Had one of the first elevators in town, manually operated, of course, very high ceilings, tin-plated, palm trees. Just had an air of elegance, steam heat. It was a nicer hotel compared to what was currently up on Commercial Street, where the Frisco Railroad actually was located. By the 1950s, the hotel was still there, still being utilized, although it didn't quite have the grandeur that it once had. And that, of course, prompted a little change to occur. although you may not know these people, but Frank Chambers, a real estate gentleman, and Mr. John O'Day, who is a descendant of the O'Day family, John O'Day in Elfingdale, um, they decided to sell the property to F.W. McClurkin. Now, he was currently the president of Hearst department store, and one thing that Hearst desperately thought that they needed downtown was more parking. So you guessed it, we got ourselves a wonderful parking lot right where the hotel once stood. Currently, if you go to Hertz Donuts downtown, you would be standing where the Metropolitan Hotel once stood. On to Drury University. Well, Drury really hasn't torn down too many things, although this particular place did get demolished, which was quite sad. It was the original building for the campus, built in 1876, named Fairbanks Hall. This photograph was taken by retired Captain William S. Johnson. Mr. Johnson was the photographer, one of our earliest in Springfield, and he took a lot of pictures, and this was a stereo picture that he had taken of Fairbanks soon after its dedication. The campus the building itself was utilized for many things over the years. Here we see a wonderful photograph of the kind of what we would consider ROTC out in front of the campus with a cannon, which is still there. In 1961, this facility would have been remodeled, mainly used as a women's dorm, and beautifully done. And then I found out that in 1978 there had been talk because the current chancellor was not living on campus. He actually was living down in Ravenwood. And from what I've been told by some of the students who were there at the time, was not a fan of older buildings. And so he opted to put both his house, the president's house, and this particular building on the chopping block, although to the public they weren't admitting that. While the students were away on, I believe it was a spring break, destruction started to occur. So when they came back, the building was too heavily damaged, although they were able to rally support behind past students and alumni to save the president's cottage. And then, of course, the chancellor was replaced with another chancellor that has lived in the house ever since. Unfortunately, right next to Lay Hall, the May Center, kind of behind it there where the building once stood, it's all open ground now. So you can't quite see where it once was, but it would have been behind the structure. And we have since lost the campus building. On to the Perkins Grand Opera House. This was built in 1888. Now, Mr. Perkins wanted to have an exceptionally grand structure, and this one fit the bill. I know of very few buildings that was this ornate or this beautiful. And on the inside, it had a heavy European feel. Big furniture, lots of gold enameled furniture, heavy drapes and carpets and paintings and glass, stained glass. It was just a beautiful building. And it had offices and other things in it as well. Well, unfortunately, by March 26 of 1896, the Opera House burnt to the ground. Originally, they had no clue what had caused the fire. Later reports were that somebody had possibly dropped a cigar back towards the costume area, and it ignited and spread very quickly. They never rebuilt the building, and this is what you would see today at Boonville and West Central. The Baldwin Theater was built in 1891, and it was a massive structure. This actually housed many business people. They had lots of offices in this particular building, as well as the theater. The theater itself was one of the grandest in Springfield, and this is a exceptionally rare postcard showing the inside, and you can see in the upper corner the booths that would pop out more for private viewing. They were quite ornate. The stage gilded in gold and a beautiful ceiling. It was just a very grand structure. Unfortunately, it was quite cold in 1909, and the boiler was overstoked, and caught fire and exploded, and the chimney burned as well. So, needless to say, the building went down pretty quick. The only thing that survived, Mr. McDaniel, H.B. McDaniel, actually had a farm south of Springfield, and those columns underneath the stone were taken to the farm. They reside there today between Springfield and Nixa. This is what was built in its place and is currently student housing. Then we come to the James Harrison Hedge Home. It was built in 1903. Now, this particular structure would mimic many of those that you're used to seeing more so in St. Louis or possibly Kansas City. And as I tell a lot of people during my presentations, many influence on Springfield came from the St. Louis area. And this one is of no doubt mimicking something that they saw up there. Just an absolutely grand structure. The house was sold in 1930 to the Springfield school system for $30,000, and it would become their headquarters. Mr. Fairbanks would keep his offices, and then the office would later become the home to one of the longest superintendents, Mr. Harry P. Studi. In 2010, the Springfield school system decided that it would cost too much to renovate this building, and decided that they would rather spend $100,000 of our taxpayer dollars to tear it down and make a lovely green field. Quite sad. It's hard to imagine that we've lost that building. Then we come to the YMCA at St. Louis and Jefferson. They would spend over a year raising the funds to build this grand structure in 1905, and a grand structure it was. Quite unique in Springfield. Don't see too many turrets on buildings, but this one just really stood apart from a lot of structures in the area. Unfortunately, it too, during a very cold spring, caught fire due to the boiler as well, and burnt to the ground. By the 20s, though, you would have thought something would have been built in its place, but for whatever reason, it kind of just was left alone. And here we are in today's time frame, and we just see a small park. So next time you're down that way and you happen to be standing in that park, you'll be standing where the original Y was. One of the saddest buildings we're about to talk about is the Colonial Hotel, and this is very sad in the sense that we should never have lost this building. Built in 1907 on the corner of St. Louis and Jefferson, it was the brainchild of John T. Woodruff. It was the first hotel in Springfield to actually, our first building, to be steel framed. It was started in 1906. They finished it in August of 1907. Cost them $300,000, or about $8 million today, adjusted for inflation. And it was the hotel of hotels to be at as far as Springfield was concerned. You would have many grand parties. This is a well-known photograph of a Christmas party by some students in the 20s in the Grand Ballroom. And then, of course, we're looking on Jefferson, looking to the south, and we can see those wonderful columns, which we'll be talking about shortly. And those had been removed earlier on as they needed to widen the street. Of course, there were many parties and gatherings at the hotels, and many of the employees just loved there and would be there for 20, 30, 40 years. Jackson Day dinners were a big event. And you saw many people year after year after year there. What's nice in the upper photograph, you can see the beautiful plaster medallions that were on the ceiling, and then the painting, more of an Asian influence on the walls. The gentleman in the far left corner, he had the distinction of having worked at that hotel for 45 years. Of course, we had many presidents and dignitaries come stay at the Colonial. In the early days, we'd have Taft had been there. And of course, we have here Harry Truman. And it was just a busy place right on St. Louis, across from the Galoits, not far from downtown. So there was just a lot of activity there. Well, let's jump ahead If you have a hotel, you have to keep it up and you have to maintain it and you have to update it, make it fresh. And unfortunately, that had not been done. And by 1977, even though it only not even been around 100 years, it already was starting to look a little worn. And from talking to some past employees, in the last 10 years of its life, it was in pretty rough shape, especially the back of the building. So, what had happened in 1996, the gentleman that owned the hotel had walked into SMS and basically said, I'll give it to you as a gift, and they took it. The problem was nobody really knew at that time what to do. The campus wasn't growing quite as fast as it is now, and had they kept it, it would have really helped out with student housing. They did get some money through some grants that were used to remove asbestos and to gut the hotel. Unfortunately, there was some problems of how the money was utilized, who they got it from, and then how would they pay for restoration and so forth. And they just opted it was cheaper if they just sold it to somebody or tore it down. And they opted to tear it down. The sad thing was there was a group that approached them after they had signed the paperwork with the demolition company that wanted to buy it and restore it, and they refused them as they said they've already signed the contract. So, in the fall of 1997, if you were downtown, you started to see the sign come down, and day by day, you saw the wrecking ball smacking the side of the building, and many people would show up downtown. Just like this gentleman over here, Sam Schilling, who's 12-year-old that showed up to grab some bricks. I've talked to many people that still have some of the bricks as they went down there and asked the workers if they would hand them to them. Today, we have a lovely parking lot. Surprise, surprise. But the one saving grace, if there is any at all, is the fact that the columns do have a home. They are in Phelps Grove Park. They are just west of the Art Museum, where the amphitheater was built in 1936 by the WPA. And so that is all that is left of the Colonial Hotel, which is really kind of sad because it's a shame that we don't have blueprints, more interior pictures, just memorabilia. There's just nothing. Nobody had any foresight to go, oh, maybe we should take pictures and document it before we tear it down. So hopefully, and this is one of the reasons why Landmarks Board came into being, that we can try to slow things down a little bit to get the opportunity to at least document something before it's totally lost. That brings us to the George Cannell home. Mr. Cannell was a butcher that had came to Springfield in 1870 and was the main butcher for the north side, had his own dairy farm, kept a lot of animals there just for his butcher shop, and was on Commercial Street for many, many years. In 1911, he finally decided that he had had enough, and he decided to build this grand home at Cherry and National for the grand sum of $6,000, and lived there for some time, and then he sold it to the Quinn family. The Quinn family later on would sell it, and it would be in the health department for Greene County. They kept their offices there. And then around 1971, the Sigma Chi decided to make it their house. For whatever reason, in 1976, the owner opted to tear it down. Now, he did have somebody approach him about restoring it, and they had another group put together. But surprise, surprise, the wrecking ball and bulldozer folks showed up and took the house down before that could be materialized. And that happened through March of 1976. And today, well, we have this. Well, the Great Fire on the Square, I've talked about many times on my Springfield history page. And it's a great tragedy. The area that's over there on the square has seen multiple fires over the years, and we don't know why this particular area tends to want to burn. But we can see the Nathan's Clothing and the Hearst department store and Osborne Jewelry and the Weaver Shoes. And, it's just a bustling area. We don't get to see Springfield, except during major festivals, look like this on the square anymore. This particular photograph was taken the day before the Great Fire, and nobody suspected anything, and nothing looked like there was going to be any problems. June 9th, 1913, the fire breaks out in the back of Herr's storeroom. Well, the sad thing was, Francis Xavier Herr was on vacation in Colorado with his family and received a wire at the hotel. Store burned. It is the cause of a fire. The entire square is northeast corner of the square is gone. He was devastated. They canceled their vacation, immediately came back to Springfield, and then he also helped those other stores and businesses find places to go and tried to aid as much as he could. He felt horribly just sorry that this occurred, especially since his store kind of caused the problem. With the paint and thinners that were next door at the paint shop, it exploded and burned very, very quickly. They estimated the loss at that time in 1913 to be $1 million. And this is a photo of the fire while it was in full force. This was taken just 3 hours after the fire started, and there's nothing left, just shells of what stores once were there. And again, it was just a tragic, tragic loss. So today, when you go down there, we do have new buildings that replaced it. We have the Holland building. We have the Rep/JCPenney store, which is now a government building. And we have the jeweler that is there. And, of course, Nathan's became the History Museum. Midtown. Well, Midtown, unfortunately, has had its share of loss over the years. Lester Cox. Well, Burge Hospital had been a humble little hospital up there for some time and just had a few buildings. And Lester Cox, being the progressive person that he was, opted that we needed to do more expansion and make it a greater hospital. So, as you can see here, where the hospital footprint is, that we do not have the towers to the west on Lynn, or that parking lot left. All that would be destroyed. And then to the north, on North Roberson of the current hospital, all those houses would be taken out as well. And what we'll be looking at next is on Benton. And you can see it better on this slide, just north of the parking lot, looking up towards Boyd School. You can see all these beautiful big homes on Benton that unfortunately would not be there much longer. But Lester did get a lovely statue and a fountain for himself. So let's look at a few of the homes that were going to meet their demise. Here we have 1407 North Benton, built by Charles Edward Harwood. In 1934, O.K. Armstrong acquired the house, and he did willingly sell it to Lester Cox. And then he purchased the house back for $500 with the intent that he could salvage the staircases, the fireplace mantels, the pocket doors, the doors, just anything, the wood trim, stained glass windows, anything he could get out. And then he took all of this to Wilson Creek Battlefield and built a house up on the hill right next to the General Sweeney Civil War Museum. And his house there still stands with all of the great stuff from Mr. Harwood's house. Here's another photo of O.K. Armstrong standing in front of his house. Next door, we have the 1417 North Benton, built by Andrew and Ella O'Hara, and it was acquired by Ed V. Williams. Now, a lot of us know Ed V. Williams because Mr. Williams had his department store, 2 of them, on Commercial Street, also has a school named after him, and he was there from 1913 to 1935. It was acquired by Lester Cox and demolished in 1962. Next door, we have 1431 North Benton, built in 1930 by O.L. Allen. It was built for Richard and Allis and Lawrence Woodbridge Allis, and acquired by Lester in 1962, also to be demolished. This one's a real tragedy. I mean, for the life of me, I cannot understand tearing this one down. I would have built the parking lot around it because this is such an awesome house, and it was in great shape. This was built by Harry H. Hughes. Now, Mr. Hughes, I've spoken of several times on my page. He was a miner. He mined in South America. He mined here in the States and in Mexico. And he invented some mining techniques. He was a wealthy, wealthy man. And so he built this home in 1903 for $20,000, which was quite a sum of money. Actually had a stone carver from Germany come over and carve the outside. It was known to have the prettiest entryway in all of Springfield, and you can see why, with the coffered ceilings that are paneled and all the heavy wood, the curved wood, the crystal lights from Austria. It was just a stunning place. Well, Springfield Library System had owned the house from 1951 to 1961. They sold it to Lester Cox, and Mr. Cox had it abruptly torn down the following year. So today, those wonderful homes that once stood on Benton are now the northeast end of the parking lot facing Benton, and even the fountain is not there anymore. So all we have is kind of a small grass cross, if I should say. But that was not the end of the destruction. Like I said, they would eventually tear down most everything around the hospital, and including the Shepherd home. So 1503 North Benton was purchased in 1894 by Dr. Edward Martin Shepherd. Mr. Shepherd the family had owned the home until 1973, so well after the time frame of the other places. Lester Cox had acquired the house. Why, we did not know, because it was across the street. And then, surprise, surprise, we were told that it was accidentally torn down. Supposedly had been given the wrong address to the demo crew. And this is what replaced that house. Route 66, the St. Louis Street Killer. Now, St. Louis Street, for all intents and purposes, was one of the grandest streets in all of Springfield. Some of the most beautiful homes that ever existed once stood on this street. Route 66, even though many have great admiration for the highway and its memories, was quite detrimental to the center of our town, impacting what once was a grand street. First building we'll talk about was built at 1458 East St. Louis, or St. Louis Street, in 1928. It was built for Pierce Petroleum Bus and Tourist Terminal, very soon thereafter become Greyhound Terminal, and they were there until 1979. And then the building, unfortunately, was torn down in 1986 and is now a parking lot for the Discovery Center. Next, we have the Thompson Tire Company, built by Will W. Johnson, 1928, southeast corner of St. Louis and Kimbrough, or the actual address would be 600 East St. Louis, and it would be torn down to give us the newer Bell Building, which is still there, although it is sparsely occupied. Next, we have Oliver Williams Fisher's house. Now, Mr. Fisher was a lumber baron. He had mills all over North America, so basically in Canada, United States. He had massive homes up in Washington and Oregon. This home that you see here was considered to be kind of like a little summer getaway. It was built in 1897. Now, it saw a very short life, and we don't know why it did. But what was built in this place, a lot of people would say was a betterment, if you will. And we've got the Shrine Mosque that built right where that house once stood. Next to the shrine, we have the George Milligan home. It's built at 525 East St. Louis in 1889. Harry S.H. Simmons and Emma McGregor Simmons called this home for quite some time. In much later years, Howard Garrison of the Riverside fame out of Ozark, him and Howard Ritzinger had the Riverside Townhouse as a restaurant for quite some time. Very ritzy place to go eat. Next to that, we would have John O'Day. We mentioned Mr. O'Day earlier when a relative of his used to own the land where the Metropolitan Hotel stood. He had a house at 577 East St. Louis, built in 1891. Beautiful Queen Anne Victorian, just absolutely stunning. Well, as time wore on, the problem with Route 66 was that most people that have money and have larger homes, they really don't like a lot of traffic in front of their house. And that's what they got, because basically all the traffic was routed down St. Louis Street to get to the square. And because of that, some of these grand homes were sold off to used car lots, and they basically parked the cars in the front yard. Sometimes they'd use the house, sometimes they had a makeshift shed outside, but the houses were just left to kind of rot away as they used them as car lots. Sears came into town and decided that they were going to build away from the square. Everybody thought they were nuts. Why in the world do you think you'd have any success being that far away from the square? They thought otherwise and acquired all the houses and the other businesses that had popped up on that section of St. Louis Street. And then they slowly started tearing them down in 1953. And here we see the aforementioned house that had been a restaurant being in the process of being demolished. Spring of 1954, Sears would open its doors, and we had a big Sears building and parking lot, and of course right next door, in later years, they would build the Springfield Expo Center. So all of it had been pretty much replaced by Sears and the Expo Center. Across the street at 550 East St. Louis, we had the beautiful home. This would have been probably one of the oldest homes in Springfield if it stood today, built in 1858 for Colonel Henry Shepard. It was acquired, though, in the 20s by John T. Woodruff, who would then build the Kentwood Arms Hotel. So some would say that would have been a benefit. It's just a shame to lose such a beautiful structure. Horace Bunch McDaniel, or HB as most people knew him as, his house was built at 597 East St. Louis in 1926. Not an old house, but definitely a grand house, and definitely mimicking some of those up in St. Louis. It would be later converted over to a club that it was used for some time, and then in later years it would even seen as a bar, restaurant type facility. It is now a lovely parking lot, or parking garage, I should say. I stand corrected. Across from that, we at 576 East St. Louis, we have the Curran home. Mr. Curran was the one of the owners of the Springfield Wagon Company, and he built this beautiful Mediterranean home in 1898. He would sell it to Doug and Mary Landers. And Doug and Mary would stay here for some time, and they unfortunately, Doug would pass away in 1926. Mary would later on marry his business partner, Mr. J.A. Nichols, and they would gut the inside of this house and bring all of its fineries, all of its staircases and woodwork and mantels and anything that wasn't nailed down that they could use, and they brought it down to the Roundtree area. And they ended up building this beautiful house at 1601 East Catalpa. And at the time, it was estimated to cost close to $40,000, a tremendous amount of money at the time, considering most houses were only $5,000. But although it was a newer house, a lot of the interior had came from the 1898 house. And it still stands there today at the northeast corner of Catalpa and Delaware. Today, where the home once stood, is part of the exhibition halls, if you will, next door to the University Plaza Hotel. Next, we come to another Shepard, and a lot of Shepards losing houses. Charles Shepard's home, built in 1859, just like the other house. Charles was the brother, and his wife, Elizabeth, and then their daughter, Helen. Helen had stayed there for many, many years. Eventually, they would sell the house as well, and in 1960, the house was demoed to make way for Don Lowe's Hamburgers. Now, I know many people love Don Lowe's and have great memories, but I don't know if a hamburger joint was necessary for the house. But I digress. It happened. Right next door was the Cannonball bar in the Frisco rail car. And then, of course, it met its fate as it would become part of the parking lot for University Plaza Hotel. Which brings us to our good friend and lover of older homes, John Q. Hammonds. Mr. Hammonds decided that downtown really needed a boost and decided University Plaza was the ticket. His project would be the largest destruction of older homes in one project. So he's not guilty of tearing down the most, but he did tear down the most in one setting. So as we look at this, we can see the plan. You can see all of those lots where there were houses and they were all numbered. All those were to be businesses or houses were to be demolished to make way for University Plaza Hotel. And we can see in this slide here, we can see the Firestone building and then the arrow pointing to Don Lowe's where the Shepherd House used to sit. And pretty much everything you see and a little bit more would be done away with. The only thing that we see in this picture behind the dotted lines just to the north would be the south side of Walnut Street. And all of those houses did survive. And here is John with his grand plan of what would happen down there with all the new buildings. First one we lost was and I'm only going to speak on the houses on Walnut. There were Dollison and in St. Louis and others, just way too many to get into. So we're just going to focus on the few that were on Walnut Street. So we have Frank R. Massey. Unfortunately, they had built this contraption on the front of the house, some sort of enclosed porch deal. Obviously, it became more like a boarding house. Mr. Massey was a miner that had moved to Springfield, and this was built in 1893. Next house was Everett Cyrus Jones' house, built in 1907. He was a realtor. Next, we have the Dan McCrae house, built in 1905, also a realtor. Then we have the Harrison Harry Milton Smith house, built in 1905. He was a farmer that somewhat had retired and became a realtor moving to Springfield. John D. Pipkin house, built in 1909. Mr. Pipkin was a druggist, an investor. He had partially owned the Hall Pipkin drug. He was also a capitalist, invested in many projects. This house was still there as a duplex. This one's really beautiful. Unique structure. We don't see this much here. We see it a little more in St. Louis. The Mary B. Kimbrough Hackney home, built in 1881 at 819 East Walnut. And we get one of the first of two McGregor houses, Charles McGregor's. His house was built in 1898. Unfortunately, they did not have a front picture, only a picture of them removing the beautiful leaded glass window. He was one of the partners in the McGregor Knoll Hardware Company. Next door was Archibald, or Arch, as most people knew him, McGregor's house, built in 1898 at 839 East Walnut. Then we get to Jesse McCann. Mr. McCann was a publisher, printer, had this beautiful home. At the time, I believe he was single. He later on would actually go into building houses, which is kind of a change from doing print, but that's what he opted to do. And then we have the Montgomery Harry Sanford Jewell home, built in 1902. Now, Mr. Jewell, at the time that he was living there, was the president of Springfield Newspapers Incorporated. Then we had the Thomas B. Lillian Davis home, built in 1889 at 919 East Walnut. He was a bookkeeper for the Silsby Stove Company. And last but not least, we have the Daniel H. and Nellie Herman home, built in 1897. Now, Mr. Herman was known as Herman the Tailor. He had moved here. He was a Jewish tailor that had moved here from Germany and settled, and was well known for his fine garments that he produced, and highly sought after as far as clothing was concerned. So, during the construction of University Plaza, the homes were dismantled. Some people were able to go in and remove some things. Many of them, unfortunately, just met the fate of the bulldozer and are living comfortably in the landfill north of Springfield. And here's what we have today. So everything on the south side of Walnut is pretty much still standing, and everything on the north side of Walnut was torn down. And you see University Plaza. The only thing that's old, although it did replace something old, is the Kentwood Arms Hotel. So I had done a poll on my page asking what person or entity had removed, destroyed the most homes and or businesses in Springfield's history. And everybody got this one pretty right. It was Missouri State University has removed the most older homes in all of Springfield. If you look back in 1920, the campus was considerably smaller, and we only had Carrington Hall. The other two halls that would come along, and this slide's mismarked, it should say 1930s instead of 20s, but you can kind of see the other two halls that had already been built, and we can see at Grands and King where the football stadium would eventually be. It currently was up on Madison. This next two pictures will kind of put in perspective what has transpired. So if you look at where it says Normal and Grand on your left, most all the homes along Normal have been removed. If you go from the football field up to Holland, where that would be where Phelps School sits, pretty much everything there over towards Elm Street and down to National has been altered or removed. All those houses have been destroyed, removed, built over, whatever you want to call it. They're no longer there. Even by the 50s, you can still see many of them were still there, as I've had many people make stories, tell stories of living in that area and going to some of the small markets and little restaurants for students and stuff that were still in that area. By now, of course, we've got the football stadium, we've got McDonald's Auditorium, and other buildings are slowly being built to the north and going into the neighborhoods. Here, if you look at this slide, this one pretty much shows the intersection there in the middle of National and Grand. And pretty much all those houses south of Grand there, and some are quite large, all those have been removed. So today, all those houses I showed you on those slides have all been replaced. There's just a handful left on Elm and Cherry that have survived, that have become sororities or fraternities, but for the most part, the university has swallowed up, either with buildings or parking lots, all those older homes. More recently, we lost the Colonial Baking Company's building on guess where? St. Louis Street, and was there from 1929 to 2016 to be replaced with student housing. This one's interesting. For those that, I moved here back in 97, and I can always remember driving on Republic Road before I turned north up onto Glenstone and looking over and seeing this beautiful house sitting off in a distance with a lot of acreage around it. Always had a for rent sign, and some people always told me, yeah, it's a horse farm. And it just happens to be Ernest and Emma Schulten's house. He owned Inland Printing, and you know that building downtown because that's where Sherwin-Williams currently is. William W. Johnson, who built many of the buildings and the Frisco train station, he built this house for him for $18,000. Concrete walls and floors. Very, very solid structure. Unfortunately, it is now Farmers Park. That's what they tore down to build the Farmers Park. Well, if you look at a business, a business that kind of ate itself or tore down its own heritage, it would be the Frisco Railroad. Now, not necessarily the Frisco themselves, although they did have a hand in it. It would be more Burlington Northern and the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. But Frisco did have a hand in destruction. Part of this had to do with taxes paying a lot of taxes on empty buildings, and it's cheaper to pay taxes on land than buildings. So since nobody was giving them any breaks, they opted to take matters in their own hands. The first such building that we would lose, although this would just lose due to obsolescence, was the original train station that had been built in the 1870s and expanded over the years. This is a beautiful view, probably the sharpest one from the History Museum, showing the station at the intersection of Benton and Commercial, with the Ozark Hotel just directly to its right of it. And then we see the roundhouse and the shops and yards to the west. Today, it's an empty spot. In fact, recently it's been paved over to make way for the more parking behind the businesses on Commercial Street. Next to it, we have the new Ozark Hotel. It was the Frisco offices from 1878 to 1910. It had a fire from when it was built in 1870, burned and then rebuilt again. And it was the busiest spot in Springfield for many years, as this was the hub for the railroad as far as work was concerned. It was sold, and unfortunately it caught fire in 1927, and finally in 1931 they deemed it too unsafe to stand. So today it is the parking lot for an old gas station. The Northside Frisco shops were quite extensive and quite beautiful, as we can see in this great picture of the roundhouse, and we can see the turntable and some of the buildings around there. By 1938, this place was absolutely massive and huge and exceptionally busy. This is obviously pre-World War II, but this and the West shops were the busiest spots on the Frisco. Once we get to 1951, we can start to see a change up there as more and more diesels are used and things are being switched more and more to the West shops. They start tearing down some of these buildings. In 1953, the coaling towers came down. By 1959, they started tearing down all of the north shops, and I guess a help or a hindrance, depending on your viewpoint, it caught fire. So it's kind of speeded up the process. By 1968, the north side shops were all gone. All that was left was just big empty land and kind of a track that kind of went around the outside of it. Today, we know it as the home for BSB Tie Company. So for many people, there's hundreds and hundreds of railroad ties being manufactured up there. You can still see the outlines of what the yard used to look like with all the railroad ties laying there. Well, as I mentioned before, W.W. Johnson was hired to revitalize the old train station that had been built in 1882, and the new station opened up as a day before Christmas as a nice Christmas present for the Frisco on December the 24th of 1926. Unfortunately, in 1967, passenger service ceased to exist for the Frisco Railroad, and they did not know what to do with one of their largest stations. And, it's kind of sad because this is one of the reasons why the Landmarks Board was put together to try to document, say, protect some of these types of buildings. And whatever the reasons or excuses were at the time, nothing prevailed. So March 5th of 1977, the Frisco depot was no more, and the bulldozer moved in and made short work of it and obliterated the entire structure. Today, this is all that remains. You can go down there today to Millen, Maine, and see the tile floor of the Harvey House, as well as some of the tracks and some of the platforms that people used to catch the trains on. Well, unfortunately, the depot wasn't the only thing to meet its fate. Right next door was the Frisco Freight Depot, and it was built, and it would stand just a little over 100 years. It was built actually over the creek there, and Jordan Valley Creek. Today, this is what you see. Just the pillars that used to hold the building up, it's all gone. Next, we have the The west shops, I'm sorry, this would be the south shops, and this particular buildings, they were built by the Kansas City, Fort Scott, and Gulf, later Memphis Railroad that was absorbed by the Frisco. And this is really where they did a lot of the work on passenger cars and things of that nature, because that's where they had most of the passenger trains come to. Unfortunately, this particular shot was taken in 1944, and by the 50s, we could see that they had pretty much torn it all down. The only thing that was left standing was the High Line, and then of course the depot and the Belt Line. Today, it's all been taken over, cleaned up. The Frisco or Burlington Northern Santa Fe, this is still an active line for them. They still use a little yard there, but for the most part, there's not much action. The new diesel shops for the Frisco, and this was the first all diesel shops built west of the Mississippi. They started in 1948, completed in 1950. And even by 1951, they started adding additional bays and adding more trackage. It was an extensive program to do all this, because they had to put in diesel tanks, because now they're carrying a lot more fuel than they ever had. They were the first Class 1A railroad to go completely diesel by 1953. And as we can see from this picture going to the next, they continuously had to add on more and more bays to service all the locomotives on the line, or many of them that came through Springfield anyway. Unfortunately, by 2005, the diesel shops started to come down. Why? Didn't need them, didn't want to pay for them, and they had transferred the jobs away, and it was costing them tax revenue to keep the buildings. So this is what we have left. Just gravel and some track. Unfortunately, the Springfield shops would also meet the same fate. Established in 1909, they were the massive shops. They were actually going to be bigger, but these were quite large, the largest on the line. And they made it just 101 years. And Mike Landis did a great job of documenting it for KY3, their destruction. The metal girder system there that you see, that was part of the transfer table that they used to have for the shops. Today, if you go out there, this is all you see. It's all gone. There's nothing left. Well, I can't do this alone, so there are some folks that have been quite generous in helping me with information and photographs. Springfield Library System, Greene County Archives, Springfield News Leader, History Museum on the Square, and then private folks like Bob Pylan, Sally McAleer, and Jerry Hayden, and there are countless others. And again, I thank you for your support and your willingness to share Springfield's history. For those of you that are not on my Springfield, Missouri History, Landmarks, and Photography page, please do join. We'd love to have you, and this is where you'll learn more in-depth knowledge about what I've been speaking about. And with that, my wife and I and our little Bella would thank you very much for listening, and hope that you'll come back and listen to some more. Take care.